them forward, nail their feet down so they don't tip over.
That's right.
And see what they do to amaze us. Can they do anything to amaze us, those false idols that you've made with your own hands?
Yeah. The answer being, of course, they haven't because they can't. How does that contrast with the Lord? What's that?
All things are possible.
Yes. What are the kinds of things that he mentioned that he has done that the idols can't do or will do that the idols can't do?
Is it in here where he creates this, he tells the water where to flow, he tells us, is this, where are we there?
Well, he is the creator, and we got that in 40 as well. Yep. So he is all powerful, he's all sovereign, he controls creation. What else?
He's also gentle and full of compassion.
Anything else?
Says he'll help him.
How much control does he have over the events of history? All of it. And that's a big argument that he makes against the idols and the idol worshipers, and he's going to continue that argument. Because one of the things he keeps saying to his people is, okay, bring out the idols and let's see, how many prophecies have they proclaimed? How much have they spent telling us, how much time have they spent telling us what's going to happen, and how many of the things they've said have actually come true? 0. Let them come and make their case that they're the ones who control history. But they can't, because they never do that sort of thing. Has the Lord done that? He has done it, and he is doing it. And one of the things we got last week was this mention of a deliverer who's coming, that he's going to raise up. And we know from what's coming later, that's going to be Cyrus. And so he's predicting at least 150 years in the future, the deliverer who he's going to raise up to bring his people out of Babylon. What idol can do that? And his whole argument is they can't. So when the people of Israel end up in Babylon, and they're in the middle of suffering and struggle, who should they trust? They should trust the Lord. I mean, it might be tempting to then say, oh, well, this God didn't work. Let's trust the Babylonian gods instead. Oh, no, They're fake gods. And the Lord told him way beforehand what he was going to do and how he was going to deliver them from it. So we're going to see this theme over and over and over in Isaiah, that he's going to compare himself to the idols and say, there is no comparison. He's in a completely different category from all of this. And all of this for the sake of his people. He keeps saying these things so that his people will trust him even in the middle of difficult things. Okay. Now, what's going on here? Oh, okay. All right, so let's look at chapter 42. And I'm actually going to read the last verse of chapter 41, because it connects to chapter 42. So 41:29, he says, see, they are all false. That's the idols. Their deeds amount to nothing. Their images are but wind and confusion. Chapter 42. Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. In his law the islands will put their hope. This is what God the Lord says, he who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and all that comes out of it, who gives breath to its people and life to those who walk on it. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord, that is my name. I will not give my glory to another or my praise to idols. See, the former things have taken place, and new things I declare. Before they spring into being, I announce them to you. Sing to the Lord a new song, his praise from the ends of the earth, you who go down to the sea and all that is in it, you islands and all who live in them. Let the desert and its towns raise their voices. Let the settlements where Kedar lives rejoice. Let the people of Selah sing for joy. Let them shout from the mountaintops. Let them give glory to the Lord and proclaim his praise in the islands. The Lord will march out like a mighty man. Like a warrior, he will stir up his zeal. With a shout, he will raise the battle cry and will triumph over his enemies. For a long time I have kept silent. I have been quiet and held myself back. But now, like a woman in childbirth, I cry out, I gasp and pant. I will lay waste the mountains and hills and dry up all their vegetation. I will turn rivers into islands and dry up the pools. I will lead the blind by ways they have not known. Along unfamiliar paths I will guide them. I will turn the darkness into light before them and make the rough places smooth. These are the things I will do. I will not forsake them. But those who trust in idols, who say to images, 'You are our gods,' will be turned back in utter shame. Hear, you deaf, look, you blind, and see. Who is blind but my servant, and deaf like the messenger I send? Who is blind like the one committed to me, blind like the servant of the Lord? You have seen many things, but have paid no attention. Your ears are open, but you hear nothing. It pleased the Lord for the sake of his righteousness to make his law great and glorious. But this is a people plundered and looted, all of them trapped in pits or hidden away in prisons. They have become plunder with no one to rescue them. They have been made loot with no one to say, 'Send them back.' Which of you will listen to this or pay close attention in time to come? Who handed Jacob over to become loot and Israel to the plunderers? Was it not the Lord against whom we have sinned? For they would not follow his ways, they did not obey his law. So he poured out on them his burning anger, the violence of war. It enveloped them in flames, yet they did not understand. It consumed them, but they did not take it to heart." Okay, how does chapter 42 start in verse 1?
Here is my servant whom I uphold,
Mm-hmm.
my chosen one in whom I delight.
Yes? Keep going.
I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations.
Okay, now this chapter, literally, it begins with the word behold, or see, which is included in all translations. But it's actually important because it connects this verse to the verse right before it, which begins the same way. So the verse right before it described the nothingness of worthless idols and the nations who worship them. In fact, chapter 2 now stands in opposition to what was just described in chapter 41. So in contrast to the idols and their nothingness, now the Lord introduces someone who's altogether different, who's his own servant. The one the Lord upholds, has chosen, and delights in, and he will put his spirit on him. What's your impression of that beginning, that first verse? Who do you think he's talking about? Why? I hear everybody saying Jesus. Why? There was a woman in Shoshone who was like, because the H is capitalized. The H on him. Okay, that's fair. Anything else?
Because he delights in him, for one thing.
What does that, why do you think that means it's Jesus? I agree with you, but why? The fact that he delights in him.
His son,
That's his son, right?
and he's here to save the world,
Mm-hmm.
and God is the only one who knows that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, we had a servant described last time, which we know is Cyrus, the future king of Persia. But you don't have to read very far right here to figure out that there is something completely different about this servant. He does things no other person can do. And you get the sense he's the ultimate servant. The fact the Lord delights in him, I agree, it demonstrates there's a unique relationship between the Lord and this servant. When you get to the baptism of Jesus, that's why it matters that when God speaks from heaven, he says, "This is my son whom I love, in him I am well pleased." That delight is spoken out loud at the baptism of Jesus. And he's going to bring justice to who? Yeah, this is a worldwide thing. So you might have already noticed in Isaiah, the word justice isn't just about judicial decisions in a courtroom. Justice involves establishing a social order that's in line with the truth and righteousness of God. That's what this servant will do, and the impact he has will be worldwide. This clearly is not the Persian king. This servant is described like a king, but he's in a completely different category from Cyrus or from anybody else. Okay, now how's he described in verses 2 to 4?
He's gentle.
Mm-hmm.
He's a bruised reed.
He's not, but what will he do or not to the bruised reed?
He will not break.
Yeah, he won't break a bruised reed or snuff out a smoldering wick.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
Yeah? So that description, so he starts out by saying he won't shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. That doesn't mean he never raises his voice to be heard. It means that he comes quietly, peacefully, in humility, without an overwhelming show of force. Think about how Jesus showed up as the king. When he rode into Jerusalem as the king, what did it look like? He was on a little donkey, right? He didn't show up with a military on a war horse with a sword. He showed up quietly and in humility. That's the kind of picture you get right here. A total contrast to the arrogance and the brute force of typical conquerors like Sennacherib or Nebuchadnezzar. And then in verse 3, it continues supporting that because it describes things that are useless because they've been damaged or used up. A bruised reed won't stand up straight. A smoldering wick is about to go out. What good are they? Well, typically you'd think none at all, but this servant is not going to just trample on or dispose of people the world sees as being weak or useless. He's not going to do that. Instead, he's going to defend the weak. He's going to come to the aid of the people that the world looks down on. So there's again this implication of gentleness, patience, and care that's totally foreign to invading armies and tyrants who come to power. And he says in faithfulness, he'll bring forth justice, which means he's not going to be fickle or capricious or unjust. Everything that he does in his rule is going to have to do with righteousness, justice, and faithfulness. And when he himself is attacked, well, how will things go when there's opposition to him? Will he give up?
He won't be disheartened or crushed
Mm-hmm.
until he's established justice.
That's right.
He'll go all the way.
Yes.
So
So,
the verses, he will not shout or cry or raise his voice in the streets, also reminds me of Christ's crucifixion. He didn't rail against the people, he didn't shout out, he didn't beg for mercy, he didn't say, I'll get you.
that's right.
He went quietly through the streets
Yes,
and took the punishment.
that's right.
And this, my cross references in here too talk about the times when Jesus would say, and charge them that they should not make them known. So he wasn't announcing himself everywhere in his deeds, he actually told people to keep it quiet.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And when there's opposition, he's going to be unmoved. He's going to persevere until he accomplishes everything he's intended to accomplish. And it says even the most remote parts of the world, that's the islands, that's kind of shorthand for the places that are far off, even those places will put their hope in his teaching. God's answer to the oppressors of the world is not more oppression. And his answer to the arrogance of the world is not more arrogance. His answer is quietness and humility. And the servant is going to take all the evil into himself and he's going to return grace. And that is power. That he can do that he can absorb the evil and return grace, it's a bigger power than any other king has. He is a king like no other king before him. Now, do any of these verses sound familiar? I mean, we talked about how Jesus was quiet and, all of that. Anything else you've heard in the New Testament that sounds like this? There's some stuff in Matthew where Matthew actually talks about the bruised reed and the smoldering wick. And he links Jesus to these things in Matthew 3 and Matthew 12. So the gospel writers are looking at Isaiah and saying, oh, here he is. Here's the king. And when he shows up, nobody recognizes him as the king because he doesn't look like a typical king, but he is there to accomplish everything the Lord wants. Okay, now how is the Lord then described in verse 5?
There's the one who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and its offspring, who gives breath to the people on it, and spirit to those who walk in it.
And all that's a preface to what he's about to say.
Right.
That's interesting. Isaiah inserts this long description about the Lord, about who he is, before he gets to what he says. Why would he insert that description of the Lord right there?
As a backdrop.
Tell me what you mean.
There's oomph behind what he's going to say.
That's right. In contrast to the idols,
Yeah.
right? There is an oomph.
Yeah.
To put it technically, yeah. I mean, the things that God is saying about the servant, he can back up because of who he is. Because he's the creator, because he controls the heavens and the earth, because he controls everything. He's the one who determines life and the course of history and the people who are on the earth. Yeah, he's not like one of the idols. He can make all of these things happen because of who he is. So, what does then he say to the servant, this God who has the power to back it up? What does he say in 6 and 7?
Is he saying I am who I am there in verse 6? Because I have Lord in the uppercase, which isn't that I am?
Yeah, Lord is it's the name for God.
Yahweh.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. And so it's not like he says Yahweh, Yahweh, but the grammatical structure is intended to emphasize I am,
Mm-hmm.
the I am. Yeah.
Okay. Because
Yes.
that is what it's, like that is what Yahweh is
Yes.
saying. Okay.
Yeah. Mhm. What does he say to the servant?
I have called you in righteousness. I will take you by the hand and keep you. I will give you a covenant for all the people, a light for the nations, to open eyes that are blind and bring out the prisoner who's in darkness.
Any of that sound like Jesus? Like totally, right? So he's called the servant in righteousness. That means the servant's not going to have his own agenda. The Lord's righteousness is going to define his agenda. And the Lord's going to take hold of his hand and keep him, meaning he's going to accompany him and guard him. It's the Lord's work that the servant's going to be about. You see this all over the gospel accounts, especially in the Gospel of John, that Jesus makes an emphasis of saying he is about the Father's work alone. Everything he does, he is about the mission of the Father. So the Lord will appoint him as a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles. The people of Israel have failed miserably to keep their covenant with the Lord. But a new covenant's coming, and that covenant's going to be centered entirely on the person of the servant. And all the promises of the covenant are going to finally come to fulfillment in him. And in the dark world of the Gentiles, the sun's going to come up, and he's going to be their light. What will he do in verse 7? I know you just said this, Donna, but there's some...
Open eyes
Yeah.
that are blind
Uh-huh.
and free captives from prison and release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. So if you're an unbeliever and you're worshiping idols, and he'll take you away from that and you'll see the light of
Exactly.
Jesus.
Because when it says that he'll open the eyes of the blind, he's not just talking about physical things right here. Because all through Isaiah, we've been seeing how blindness is always pointing toward a spiritual blindness that's the result of idol worshiping. So when the servant comes, you're right, he's going to break people out of the power, the deadening power of idolatry. So it's a spiritual captivity that he's talking about right here, and he's going to get people out of it.
Well, and the same thing is going on today.
That's right.
People sitting in darkness.
Yeah,
In dungeons.
And how do you get out?
Activated by TV and
That's
all
right.
of it.
You can't free yourself. It's the servant who has to free you. Yeah. Okay, now, then what does he say to the people in verses 8 and 9?
This is kind of a bold statement. I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other. It's me.
Mm-hmm.
Nor my praise to carved idols.
Yeah. The Lord is Yahweh. I am is his name. That's the name he revealed to his covenant people. He is who he is. And he won't yield his glory to idols. Now, that's an interesting thing to say right here, because it's not that the Lord has handed his glory over to idols, but as long as people continue worshiping idols, they are getting glory that rightly belongs to God. So how will God put a stop to that? It's not just by wiping out the idols. It's by breaking people free from the captivity of idolatry. That's how he will bring the glory that is rightly his back to himself. And so he's not going to... There's glory being given to things and people besides the Lord, but God's not going to put up with that indefinitely. He will reclaim the glory that's rightly his.
And I was struck by a thought that, with Moses, God said, I am that I am. To the answer of Moses says, who shall I tell them to send me? Who are you? What is your name, God? He says, I am that I am. And I thought, Moses asked that question because the Egyptians and everybody gave names to their idols until their gods. And Moses, falling back on that, says, but what's your name? Because they've got all these other gods with the name, what's your name? And I thought, isn't that interesting that he asked, what is your name? And God said, I am that I am. That's all. And I just saw the reflection of that in his statement.
Yeah. And it's a stark contrast to the other gods, because the other gods are not who they are. The other gods are whoever people make them to be. And the Lord is not. Yeah.
Sorry. And didn't they usually, like in Egypt especially, it was over certain things?
Right.
You know?
Yep.
And Hindu religion
Water.
is saying in Shinto, you know, where it's like a specific neighborhood or
Yep.
like water or whatever, and God is saying, I am all of it.
Yeah.
Like, I am who I am.
That's
not,
right.
I am Ra, the God of, yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and then he says, well, what does he add in verse 9?
Is he saying he's fulfilled his former promises
Mhm.
already, and now he's declaring new promises too?
Yes.
Okay.
So there have been prophecies in the past that the Lord told the people in advance would happen, and his word came to pass. We know that even from things that have happened in Isaiah. I mean, there's loads of that stuff, but even all the stuff with Assyria. Now he's telling them new things are coming, and he's announcing those things beforehand because he's the one who controls history. And in particular, the new thing he's announcing is the coming of this servant. And he's telling them way ahead of time. Okay, so this isn't just 150 years ahead of time like it was with Cyrus. Now we're talking about 700 years before Jesus will arrive on the scene, and the Lord is telling the people this is what's coming. So even in this, he demonstrates himself to be completely different from the false gods of the nations. Okay, now the first part, I'm just going to pause for a second, because this first part of chapter 2 is actually the first of 4 sections that are referred to by the commentators as the servant songs of Isaiah. And they're in 42, 49, 50, and 52. And I actually have the references listed in the supplement, so I'm not going to read them all off for you. But if you're interested in knowing what all those sections are, it's in the supplement for you. So there's a servant mentioned who is Cyrus. There's a servant mentioned who is Israel. But there's a particular servant mentioned who stands out from everybody else because he is the Messiah. And there are these 4 separate sections that focus on the work of the servant, and they are about the Messiah. And this is the first one, verses 1 to 9. So there's going to be a progression through those songs, and we'll look at the next several as we go through chapter 53. Now, in response to the new thing that the Lord is doing, which has to do with the coming of the Messiah, what does Isaiah then say in verses 10 to 12?
To praise the Lord and sing a new song
Mm-hmm.
all over, everywhere.
Yeah. The new thing the Lord's going to do deserves a new song. And not just a new song from the people of Israel, but a new song from all the people to the ends of the earth. And then, just in case you're not sure how far he's talking about, he lists it all off. So how far-reaching is this song? Well, those from the ends of the earth, from the depths of the sea, from the remotest areas of the world, those in the wilderness, those in the towns, those in the desert. Kedar was in the Arabian desert. Those in the mountains, that would be Selah, which was in Edom. He says, everyone, let everyone near and far, in every possible situation, raise their voices, rejoice, sing for joy, shout, give glory to the Lord, and proclaim his praise. That's us. That includes us. Why? Because of the new thing that's coming through the servant. Because of everything that the Lord's going to accomplish through the Messiah, which is going to establish justice for the nations, and that's us. Okay, now, what will the Lord do in 13 to 17?
In contrast to the first section,
Mm-hmm.
quietly, here he comes,
Yes,
the warrior.
that's right. Like a champion.
Conqueror.
Yeah, he's going to march out to the aid of his people. He's going to raise the battle cry and triumph over his enemies. For a long time he's waited and he's kept quiet and held back, but when the right time comes, everything's going to break loose. Now, if you're on a march, what sort of obstacles hold you up? Well, mountains and large bodies of water and thick vegetation. That's what typically holds you up. What's God going to do with the obstacles? He's going to clear them all out. So he's going to march out to the aid of his people, and whatever it is that stands in his way, he's going to dry it up, remove it, get rid of it, so that nothing will stop him from accomplishing what he intends to do. There's going to be tremendous effort and cost, for the redemption of God's people, but it's to his glory that the Lord's going to undertake it at the cost to himself. And then what does he say about the blind?
Lead them by ways they have not known.
Mm-hmm.
Along unfamiliar paths, you will guide them.
Yes.
From darkness into light, and make rough places smooth. He will not forsake his people,
Mm-hmm.
but those who trust in idols and say to images, "You are our gods," will be turned back into utter shame.
Yes. So the blind, his people, they're not going to know the way. They're not going to be familiar with the way. The Lord's not going to stand back and give them directions and say, best of luck to you. The Lord is going to guide the blind. He's going to take them where they need to go. And it's not just that he's going to take them by the hand and lead them through the darkness. You notice at some point, he's going to get rid of the darkness altogether. Because he's going to turn the darkness into light, and he's going to make the rough places smooth. Yeah, because he won't forsake his people. But the idol worshippers are going to be goners. The nations that insist on worshiping their idols are going to have no deliverance. Okay, now, right before this, it was the servant who saved the blind and provided light. Now it's the Lord who does it. So which is it?
Yes.
Yes, all of it. If you know who the servant is, if you know that he's not just another prophet with amazing power, but he's God in human form, it all connects together. When the servant shows up to do all those things he does in meekness and humility, what is it that he's actually accomplishing? He is conquering, but he's not conquering through the brute force of taking over political nations. He's going to conquer sin and death. He's going to deliver people in huge ways. So don't be deceived when you see the weakness of the servant into thinking things are not being conquered in the work that he's doing. Because Isaiah says, oh yes, the Lord is doing his work of a warrior and a champion when he sends his servant. Okay, now what does the Lord say about his people in verses 18 to 20?
They're blind and deaf.
Mm-hmm. In fact, nobody's as blind and deaf as they are. You kind of get that idea from what he says. I wonder, when I first read this, it kind of threw me a bit when the Lord called his servant blind and deaf right here.
Yeah, right.
I was like, wait a minute, what? When you just read that description of the servant in verses 1 to 9, the juxtaposition of those things is supposed to get your attention. Because there are two servants being talked about in this chapter, and they're in total contrast to one another. So the one described at the beginning is the servant whom the Lord will bring in the future, the Messiah. The one who's described right here is the people of Israel. They were chosen to be his servant, to be his messenger, to be in covenant relationship with him, but they're blind and deaf. They pay no attention to what they see, they don't listen to what they hear, and all of that is because of their idolatry. It's not because they don't actually have ears or eyes, it's because idolatry has deadened their spiritual senses. There's some heavy irony right there in verse 18 that the Lord calls his servant to hear and see, but they can't, because the worship of other gods has made them spiritually lifeless. How can they be a messenger for him if they can't hear the message? They can't, and that's the problem for Israel. They've called to be a messenger, but they can't hear the message. That means there's going to have to be another messenger who comes. Now, what did the Lord do? And why? In verse 21.
It pleased the Lord to magnify his law and make it glorious.
Mm-hmm.
The Israelites are a people plundered and looted. They are trapped in holes and hidden in prisons. There is nobody to rescue them.
Mm-hmm. So what makes the blindness and deafness of Israel even more profound is that the Lord didn't keep things hidden from them. He gave them his law to guide them. He made his instruction great and glorious because of his righteousness. Okay, now just think for a minute about the weight of that. If there are Israelites who would say, well, we didn't know the instruction of the Lord was that big of a deal. Mount Sinai made it very clear how big of a deal it was. The glory of the Lord was so very visible to them the power of his holiness. Like, there was no missing it. He made it really clear how important the law was, how important covenant relationship with him was. He gave them all those instructions. They couldn't miss it. But what did they do instead? You know what they did with the law. They decided to live the way they wanted, right? Isn't it in Judges when it says they had no king and everyone did as he saw fit?
Yeah, really.
Let me read for you just a few verses from Deuteronomy. This is Deuteronomy 4, starting in verse 5. But this is where he's recapping the giving of the law. So this is Moses talking, and he says, "See, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, 'Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people.' What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them the way the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today?" I mean, what was the whole purpose of the law? To direct them in how to be in right relationship with the Lord in order to make the Lord known to the nations around them. So that in the way that the people of Israel lived, the nations around them would look at them and say, they don't live like everybody else. They don't have the same values as everybody else. What's different about them? It's their God that's different. That's what was supposed to happen, was the law was supposed to set the people of Israel apart so the nations would want to know who their God was. And what happened instead? They just started to mimic the nations. They blended in with the nations. They lived just like the nations did. And what's the result of that? Then in verse 22, they get plundered and looted. So instead of being this beacon to the nations, when they reject his instruction, they end up being oppressed by the nations they were supposed to be messengers to. So now they're trapped in pits, hidden in prisons. Instead of pointing others to the God who delivers, they end up needing deliverance for themselves. Because of their disobedience, the messenger becomes trapped and helpless, and now has no message to pass on. Now, Isaiah's going to stick it to him. Now, what does he say to the people in 23 to 25?
He tells them it was against the Lord that they have sinned, and in whose ways they were not willing to walk.
Mm-hmm.
And he just says, who's going to listen? Who's going to give heed and pay attention?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you that rhetorical question in 23. Why do you think he puts it as a rhetorical question? When he says, which of you is gonna listen or pay attention? Why use a rhetorical question instead of just saying pay attention?
He's sarcastic. Being kind of sarcastic, isn't he?
I think he's being very scolding to the
Yeah.
people right here. When he puts in the question, it's kind of like saying, you know better. How can you miss this? You shouldn't be missing what's going on right here. Pay attention to this, and it's like putting an exclamation point on it. Who's going to pay attention? All of you should be paying attention, but you're not. So Isaiah's like, pay attention. Now, who was it who handed you over to become loot? Who handed you over to be plundered? It was the Lord. And why did he do it? Because he was in a bad mood?
Because they weren't listening to him.
Because they sinned against him. That's right. It was because of their sin.
Mm-hmm.
Because he says they wouldn't follow his ways, they wouldn't obey his law, and because of that, he poured out on them his burning anger, which came out in the violence of war. Now remember who this prophecy is intended for. I mean, the first, of course, it's relevant to the people of Isaiah's time, but he's looking ahead to people who are on the other side of the Babylonian captivity, who've already been taken away into exile. And here's Isaiah saying to those people, okay, in the situation where you're at now, if you're in exile in Babylon, whose fault is it? Is it because God was not powerful enough to fight off your enemies? No, it was because you sinned. You walked away from the covenant you had with the Lord, and the Lord poured out his judgment. That's why you're in the situation that you're in. It does not imply that the Babylonian gods are greater than the God of Israel. God is the one who has brought this judgment, and when he decides deliverance is coming, he will bring deliverance. But this is why he says to the people, this is why you're in the situation that you're in. And he says, well, it enveloped them in flames, and what was their response?
They did not understand or take it to heart.
That's frustrating.
That consumed them,
That's right.
but they didn't take it.
To be overtaken by this judgment and still not get it. And Isaiah's challenging the people. Will they look at their situation and finally connect the dots? Because the $1 million question is, how did they end up oppressed and looted? Because of their own sin. And this has been the problem all through Isaiah, that they don't take to heart the things that should be obvious. But Isaiah is going to keep telling them over and over and over. It's not that God is powerless to do something about their situation. He's described God in ways over the last several chapters that leave no doubt about how powerful God is. God is powerful enough to get them out of this situation, but they're in it because of their rebellion against the Lord. If the messenger can't obey it, who can? I mean, it's a depressing ending to this chapter, because you look at it and think, well, if the messenger won't listen, all seems to be lost. It's not so much the messenger can't obey, but that the messenger won't. They're not willing to walk, they're not willing to listen in the sense of obeying. Unless something's done about that attitude, nothing else is going to change. But we just had the hope of the first 9 verses, didn't we? Because who is it who's going to break his people out of captivity and out of dungeons and out of darkness? It's the servant. It's the servant who is going to come and free the messenger from the power of idolatry. That's how the messenger will then do what they were intended to do by God all along. So it is a depressing ending, but the hope of the Messiah prefaces it. And there's 2 things too that are important here. If Israel's devastation is the result of God's judgment, then the strength of their enemies is irrelevant when it comes to their deliverance. Their enemies cannot keep them captive any longer than God allows. If their defeat was his doing, their deliverance will be his doing too, and no enemy nation can stand it. And clearly another servant besides Israel is needed to make the Lord known to his people and to the world, but we already know who that is because of the first 9 verses. There's a king coming who is going to be the servant that Israel wasn't. The Messiah is going to succeed where Israel failed, and he's going to succeed in ways that will affect the whole world. And all of that's going to lead into the more comforting words of chapter 43. So you end right here about, the consuming flame. And then you get to chapter 43, and it turns out God's going to walk through the flames with his people. He hasn't abandoned them, even in this judgment that he brings. Okay. That was a lot. How's it relevant to us?
Because we are his people.
Oh, we better obey him.
And it calls to mind the passages about how he talks about he disciplines because he loves, he disciplines because he's a father. And if he didn't love his people, then he would just give them up, and just let them be completely wicked and horrible and self-destruct. Yeah, exactly. Like they wouldn't be around anymore. There wouldn't be any Jews anymore if God had not disciplined them like a father. They would have just been wiped out. And we would not be here either. Because he wouldn't have sent Jesus.
Anything else?
I think it shows that entrapment of idol worship, taken captive.
Idol worship is kind of a tricky thing. It can sneak up on you. Whether you're, in my case, whether I was overly passionate about my horses, or include the music though. But, I mean, it can happen so easily if we're not vigilant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that last verse where it talks about the fierceness of battle that set him aflame, and yet he did not recognize it, and it burned him, but he paid no attention. I think the way that we get there is letting our pride build up with the idol worship. And we just get to where we don't want to hear it. We don't want to hear rebuke from anybody. And so we make that unsafe for people to rebuke us. And yeah, and so even when like your entire situation is burning up, you find a way to justify yourself and say, oh, poor me. Like them. And like them do that. It's very common and it's a big problem.
Well, yeah, and we've talked about this before, but when you look at that, it's really stark that you can be in the middle of terrible circumstances and be hanging on to your idols. What's the incentive to do that? What is it that causes us to hang on to idols, even in the middle of the suffering that it brings on to us? What are we getting out of that that makes us willing even to hang on to it in the middle of everything falling apart? Pride.
Independence.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Now, I can do this. Me.
Self-sufficiency.
Yeah.
And it should be obvious to us too, in what it does, because they don't bring hope to us, you know, so they don't do anything for us.
They give you a sort of short-term comfort, don't they?
It's short term, yeah.
Or a short-term kind of a feeling of being in control.
Because there's no real satisfaction from them.
That's right.
But there's the hope of satisfaction from them.
Yeah.
Of
Yeah.
blessing.
Yeah.
It's that tantalizing like out here.
Yeah.
And they're deceitful. I mean, it's easy to be deceived by it. So it's like, well, yeah, this is the healthy thing to do, or whatever. When in reality, it's taking you down a path that's going to be counter to that.
I was interested in that word jealous because that has a meaning for us that maybe we don't want to apply to God. I mean, we don't think of being jealous as a sin. But for God, when he starts the commandments, he says, have no other gods before me because I'm a jealous God. I don't want your praise to go to anybody else. And that's really an important thing we have to think about. Because he wants only our praise.
Is there a place even in human relationships where jealousy is right?
Oh yeah. Jealous.
When is it right?
Jealous of my husband. I don't want anybody else to love him. I don't want him to love anybody else either.
That's right.
We can be
There's a
jealous.
relationship right there that's important.
Yeah.
That the covenant relationship that you have with him, it is right to be jealous over his affection and vice versa, right? If you were not, that would be a problem,
Yeah.
wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah.
To be in a relationship like that and to be apathetic about the other person giving their affection away, that's the opposite of love. So there are a lot of people who don't like the idea of a jealous God, but a God who's not jealous doesn't care enough about our affections to actually come and rescue us or to discipline us.
Yeah.
He's jealous because he cares so much about
Yeah.
the relationship. And it's a right kind of jealousy. It's not a selfish kind of nobody else gets it, it's not that kind of jealousy. It's this relationship is so important to him that he's not willing to share his people with false gods. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else?
I was reading yesterday and I read that, when I thought about this before, because when they say that you should have the fear of God, I always kind of questioned that, because I thought, well, he's a loving God, why should we be afraid of him? But that afraid is being in awe of him, or being in love with him, and just feeling his greatness. just being in awe of him is being fearful of him, which is kind of a contrast, but you think of it and it's true. Because you are so in awe of him. The way that I was thinking about it was that he is just such an awesome God, and you are just so, I don't know how to explain it, but it's wonderful anyway. I don't know how to explain it all the way I want to explain it, but
I think of it in terms of the contrast between gangs and tyrants, and our God is not trying to control us. His control, his desire is for our best, not for, well, it is his best, but it's not like somebody that's just trying, I want it my way or the highway. Is because he wants the best for us. All of the ways that he would direct us morally or in any way it's a safer help. I'm not expressing it either of those, but it's just the difference, but it's a difference, like you said, it's the respect, the awe for who he is out of love. It's his love that is motivating us, not our fear of the repercussions. Yeah. If we don't. Yeah.
Well, and you can go two ways with it, because I think of the Israelites, and they saw the plagues come from heaven. I'd say they saw death right next door, and darkness come over the land. And they went out, and the Egyptians came after them, and they saw God open the sea, and then crash it down right behind them. And they saw all these things happen, and water out of a rock because he said it. So yeah, I'd be afraid.
Well, yeah,
I'd be afraid if I went up to the mountain Sinai and it was shaking and rumbling and there was lightning and trumpets that weren't coming from me. It's a healthy fear, but you can choose to go, holy cow, and turn to a cow. or you can go, okay, God, I'm all in because I trust you. You are terrifying and I want to be with you.
yeah.
And it's a fear, but it's like, it's knowing who God is, and it's saying, yeah, I want to be with you, because you are the greatest power. Yeah.
And it is all about knowing who he is and responding to who he is. And you've said that, Kelton, when keep looking at who God is.
There's a fear that attracts you, isn't there?
Yes.
Because I always think about that, growing up in landlocked Wyoming when I was a kid. Every once in a while we go to the coast, you go to the ocean, and the ocean scared me. But not the kind of scary where I wanted to run away. The sort of scary where it fascinated me because it was so powerful and it was so big. And I was kind of scared, but I wanted to go, Isn't it that kind of like there's an attractiveness to something even where you're not afraid of what it's, you don't want to run away from it, but you have a healthy sense of this is more powerful than me and I had better pay attention,
Here's where I was reading it. It says the best kind of life comes to those who live with fear of God in their hearts. Living in fear means in awe, respect, and reverence. Those who do this will try always to know and do God's will. That will mean self-discipline, but it will result in self-mastery, one of the sweetest satisfactions in life. These people, although they may experience difficulty and pain, will not suffer evil.
Where are you reading
So,
this?
I got this with the Bible that I ordered. It's from Guideposts.
And because we have his word, and because some are incredible students of it, we can look back. We have the benefit of looking at what he really did. It's incredible that we have that to look at, and the 150 years before to name the exact man, and the prophecies about Christ is, when you look at how many were fulfilled that nobody could have purposed. I mean, I've heard that expressed. No man, mere man, could have fulfilled all those prophecies. You just couldn't have orchestrated all of those things. So that's who God is. He's the one that did all of that. So yeah, that is a fearful. Yeah, he means business.
I'm gonna call on people with better memory than I, like Brittany or Lindsay or somebody like that. What is said about Aslan, is he fearful, is he
Yeah.
good? Give me the phrase, remember the conversation?
He's not
Remember?
safe. He's
Yes.
not safe,
He's not
but he's
safe.
good. But he's good. Yeah.
Yeah.
No one said he was safe.
That's right. But that's from the book what? Lion
The
of the
Lion
True
of
Word.
the True
Yeah.
It's a beautiful phrase to describe God.
Mhm.
Either you bow down or you run.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah,
And you
because
can't
out
outrun him.
out of your awe and your respect and reverence for him, you're going to obey him, and you're gonna, you don't wanna lose that.
Yep. Yeah, fear should take you toward him.
Right,
Yeah.
that
Not away
fear
from
should
him.
take you towards him.
That's right.
It's just like you had explained once before, it's just like the relationship you have with your father, with your earthly father, you're now again, you're not afraid of him, but
You know what he can do to you.
but still, yeah, but still,
miss.
you know that you have to obey him and you
Yeah.
have to.
That's,
So that
It's a
draws
healthy
you to
fear.
him too, because that gives you your respect for him.
If all we had in the Bible was descriptions of the naked power of God, then it would be scary
Yeah.
in a bad way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But all over the Bible, it combines the power and sovereignty of God with his mercy and compassion toward his people. You have to know both.
Right.
You have to know that he's powerful and that he's merciful.
Yeah.
And that is what should draw you to that guy.
Right.
All right, we're going to stop there.
I have another one.